The year is 1481. In the city of Seville, in the kingdom of Castile, a man named Juan de Sevilla wakes before dawn to the sound of boots on cobblestones. He lies still, listening. The footsteps stop outside his door. There is a knock, not the casual knock of a neighbor, but the slow, deliberate knock of authority. He knows what it means. Everyone in Seville knows what it means. Within the hour, he is gone. His neighbors will not ask where. His family will not speak his name in public. The city will simply absorb his absence, the way a river absorbs a stone, quietly, completely, without a ripple. This is how the Inquisition worked. Not always with fire and spectacle, though those moments came. More often, it worked through silence, through fear, through the knowledge shared by every man, woman, and merchant in Catholic Europe that belief itself had become a matter of state surveillance. The Spanish Inquisition alone operated for nearly 350 years. It reviewed tens of thousands of cases. It shaped the intellectual, religious, and political life of an entire civilization. And yet, when most people hear the word Inquisition, what they picture is a caricature, a torture chamber, a rack, a hooded figure with a torch. The reality is both more complex and, in many ways, more disturbing than the caricature. Because the machinery of the Inquisition was not built by monsters. It was built by believers, by lawyers, by theologians who genuinely thought they were saving souls. And that is what makes it one of the most important and unsettling stories in the history of Western civilization. So let us go back. Let us understand how this machinery was built, how it operated, who it targeted, and why its shadow stretched so far across the centuries that we are still reckoning with it today. To understand the Inquisition, you have to understand the medieval Catholic Church, not as an institution of pure spiritual authority, but as the central organizing force of European society. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Church was not simply where you went on Sundays. It controlled education, marriage law, inheritance, the legitimacy of rulers, and the moral framework within which all of public life operated. There was no separation between religious authority and civil power. They were woven together so tightly that a challenge to one was automatically a challenge to the other. This matters because it explains why heresy, the holding of beliefs contrary to church doctrine, was treated not merely as a spiritual error, but as a social and political emergency. When a group of people in southern France in the early 1200s began following a dualist theology called Catharism, which rejected the authority of the Catholic Church entirely, the Church did not see this as a theological debate. It saw it as an existential threat. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, believed that the material world was created by an evil god and that the Catholic Church, with its wealth, its land, and its institutional power, was part of that evil. They were building their own communities, their own spiritual hierarchies. They were, in the eyes of Rome, a civilization within a civilization. Pope Innocent III launched a military campaign against them in 1209, the Albigensian Crusade, which resulted in widespread destruction across the Languedoc region of what is now southern France. Towns were burned, populations were massacred, but military force, it turned out, was a blunt instrument against a theological movement. You could destroy a village. You could not so easily destroy an idea. And so, in the aftermath of the Crusade, a new institution began to take shape. One designed not to overwhelm heresy with force, but to root it out through investigation, interrogation, and judgment. This was the beginning of what historians call the medieval Inquisition. Pope Gregory IX formally established inquisitorial tribunals in 1231, appointing Dominican friars as inquisitors, men trained in theology and logic, skilled in debate, committed to the idea that the soul of a heretic could be saved if the heresy could be identified and renounced. The word Inquisition itself simply means inquiry, investigation. It derives from the Latin inquisitio, a legal term for a formal examination of facts. The institution was, at its core, a legal and theological procedure. And this is the first important thing to understand. The Inquisition was not random terror. It had rules, it had procedures, it had a logic. And that logic, however disturbing its consequences, was internally coherent. Here is how it worked in practice. When inquisitors arrived in a town, they typically announced a period of grace, a window of time, usually a few weeks, during which anyone who had held heretical beliefs could come forward voluntarily, confess, and receive a relatively lenient penance. This was not merely theatre, The inquisitors genuinely preferred confession and reconciliation to punishment. Their theological framework held that the worst possible outcome was not a person being punished, it was a person dying in a state of unrepentant heresy, which meant in their understanding eternal damnation. The goal was to save the soul, even if saving it required coercion. After the grace period, the inquisitors would begin receiving accusations, and here the machinery becomes darker. Accusers were, in the early period, kept anonymous. The accused could not confront their accusers directly. They could submit a list of personal enemies, people whose testimony, they argued, should be discounted on grounds of personal hostility, but the fundamental asymmetry of the process was built into its structure. The accused needed to prove a negative, that they did not hold heretical beliefs. In a system where the inquisitor was both investigator and judge, where the standard of proof was the confession rather than independent evidence, and where the pressure to confess was immense, the outcome of many trials was predetermined not by guilt, but by the architecture of the process itself. Torture was formally authorized by Pope Innocent IV in 1252, in the papal bull Ad Extirpanda. It is important to be precise about what this authorization said and did not say. The bull permitted the use of physical coercion to extract confessions, but it placed limits on its use. It could not be applied in ways that caused permanent injury or death. It could only be used once in a given case, and confessions obtained under torture had to be freely ratified by the accused the following day without duress. In practice, these limits were frequently circumvented by redefining once as once per session, by applying psychological pressure during the ratification process, by using forms of coercion that left no visible marks. But the limits existed. The Inquisition was not a system of pure, unregulated violence. It was a system of regulated, procedurally justified coercion, which is, in some ways, a more disturbing thing to contemplate. The sentences handed down by inquisitorial tribunals ranged widely. Many accused heretics were sentenced to wear yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing, a mark of shame and public identification that could last for years. Others were sentenced to make pilgrimages, to fast, to perform charitable works. Imprisonment was common. Confiscation of property was common, and this is a point worth pausing on because the financial dimension of the Inquisition is often underplayed. When a person was convicted of heresy, their property could be seized by the church or the secular authority. This created an economic incentive that, over time, shaped who was targeted and how aggressively. Wealthy conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, in 15th century Spain were, by no coincidence, disproportionately represented among those investigated. The most severe sentence, burning at the stake, was reserved for relapsed heretics, those who had previously confessed and been reconciled to the church, but who had returned to their heretical beliefs. The church itself did not carry out executions. This is not a technicality designed to absolve it of responsibility. It is a structural feature of the system. Convicted heretics were relaxed to the secular arm, handed over to civil authorities with a formal request for mercy, which the civil authorities were expected to ignore. The burning was a civil execution, carried out on church authority. The distinction mattered enormously in the theological and legal self-understanding of the institution. It matters less in the history of the people who died. Now, here is something that will surprise many viewers, and it is one of the genuine wow facts of this history. The medieval Inquisition, despite its fearsome reputation, was in many respects more legally rigorous than the secular courts of the same period. Outside the Inquisition, in the ordinary criminal courts of 13th century Europe, defendants had almost no procedural protections at all. They could be tortured without limits. They had no right to know the charges against them. They had no right to legal counsel. The Inquisition, by contrast, required that charges be formally stated, that the accused be given the opportunity to respond, that legal counsel, however limited, be available, and that confessions be ratified. This does not make the Inquisition just. It makes the context in which it operated darker than we sometimes imagine. The medieval Inquisition was primarily focused on theological heresy, Cathars, Waldensians, and other dissenting Christian movements. It operated across France, Italy, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe. It reached its first major peak in the 13th century, began to decline in the 14th, and then, after a long pause, was reborn in a dramatically different form in 1478, in the Kingdom of Spain. And this is where the story takes its most significant and most studied turn. The Spanish Inquisition was a different institution from its medieval predecessor, and understanding the differences is essential. It was established not by the Pope, but by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella with papal authorization. It operated under royal, rather than purely ecclesiastical authority. Its targets were not primarily theological heretics, but rather conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, and later Moriscos, Muslim converts, who were suspected of secretly continuing to practice their original faiths. And it operated within a specific political context: the unification of the Spanish kingdoms, the completion of the Reconquista, and the construction of a new national identity built around Catholic orthodoxy. To understand why Ferdinand and Isabella established the Inquisition, you have to understand the peculiar social situation of late 15th century Spain. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been home to one of the most complex, multi-religious societies in medieval Europe. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived in close, if not always peaceful, proximity for generations. The Jewish community in particular had produced many of Spain's most prominent physicians, financiers, scholars, and royal advisors. But the 14th century brought a catastrophic change. In 1391, a wave of anti-Jewish violence swept across the peninsula, with pogroms in Seville, Córdoba, Valencia, and Barcelona. Faced with death, tens of thousands of Jews converted to Christianity. These were the conversos, and their conversion created a social and religious crisis that would define Spanish history for the next century. The problem, from the perspective of the old Christian establishment, was this: the conversos had converted, but had they really converted? Many had done so under duress. Some continued to observe Jewish practices in private, lighting candles on Friday evenings, following dietary laws, circumcising their sons. Others had genuinely embraced Christianity and were indistinguishable from old Christians in their beliefs and practices, but the suspicion was general, and it was inflamed by economic resentment. Conversos, freed from the legal restrictions that had limited Jewish participation in certain professions, had moved quickly into positions of influence in the church, the universities, the royal court, and the merchant class. Old Christian families who had been passed over for appointments resented this. The accusation of secret Judaizing, practicing Judaizing in secret while publicly professing Christianity, was both a religious charge and a social weapon. Ferdinand and Isabella established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, with the first tribunal beginning operations in Seville in 1480. The man who would come to define the institution, and whose name became synonymous with its harshest methods, was Tomás de Torquemada, appointed Inquisitor General of Castile and Aragon in 1483. Torquemada was himself of converso descent, a fact that historians have noted without fully resolving its significance. He was a Dominican friar, deeply pious, intellectually rigorous, and utterly convinced that the converso community harbored a secret fifth column of crypto-Jews who were corrupting Spanish Christianity from within. Under his direction, the Spanish Inquisition became the most systematically organized inquisitorial body in European history. Torquemada codified the procedures of the Spanish Inquisition in a series of instructions issued between 1484 and 1498. He established a network of tribunals across Spain. He created the Suprema, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, which sat in Madrid and oversaw the regional tribunals, reviewed their sentences, and maintained records of extraordinary detail and comprehensiveness. The Spanish Inquisition kept better records than almost any other institution of its era, and this is one reason we know as much as we do about its operations. Those records, preserved in archives in Madrid and elsewhere, have been the subject of intensive scholarly study since the 20th century, and they have produced findings that complicate the popular image of the institution in important and sometimes counterintuitive ways. The most important revisionist finding concerns the scale of executions. For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition was described, particularly in Protestant Europe and later in Enlightenment literature, as an institution of mass slaughter. Figures of hundreds of thousands executed were cited. The reality, as established by modern archival research, is different. Historians including Henry Charles Lear, Henry Kamen, and others who have worked through the surviving records estimate that the Spanish Inquisition executed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people over its entire history of roughly 350 years. This is not a small number. These were real people who died in circumstances of terror and injustice. But it is dramatically lower than the mythological figures that entered popular consciousness, and it is important to say so clearly. What this means is not that the Spanish Inquisition was less harmful than we thought. It means that its harm operated primarily through mechanisms other than execution. The primary tools of the Spanish Inquisition were surveillance, denunciation, social stigma, financial ruin, and the pervasive atmosphere of fear that it generated. Consider what it meant to live in a society where your neighbors could denounce you to the Inquisition, where the accusation itself, regardless of its outcome, could destroy your reputation, where the records of your trial were preserved and could be used against your descendants, where the concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, meant that having a converso ancestor could bar you from certain positions, certain honors, certain institutions for generations. The limpieza de sangre statutes are worth pausing on because they represent one of the most disturbing long-term consequences of the Inquisition's logic. Beginning in the mid-15th century and spreading rapidly after 1492, many Spanish institutions, universities, military orders, cathedral chapters, municipal governments began requiring candidates to prove that they had no Jewish or Moorish ancestry. This was a racial categorization, not a religious one. A person whose great-grandparents had converted to Christianity a century earlier, who had been raised as a Catholic, who had never practiced anything but Catholicism, could still be barred from advancement on the grounds of blood. The Inquisition did not create the limpieza de sangre statutes, but its operations reinforced and legitimized the social logic that produced them. Several historians, including the scholar Ben-Zion Netanyahu, father of the Israeli politician, have argued that the Spanish Inquisition represents an early form of racial persecution, not merely religious persecution. This interpretation is contested, but it is a serious scholarly argument that deserves to be heard. The year 1492 is one of the most consequential in Spanish history, and not only because of Columbus. In January of that year, Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. In March, they issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. The timing was not coincidental. The Reconquista had been presented as a religious crusade, a project of Christian unification. The expulsion of the Jews was its logical conclusion in the eyes of its architects. Between 150,000 and 200,000 Jews left Spain. The estimates vary, and historians debate the precise figures. They went to Portugal, to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to Italy. They took with them their skills, their networks, their capital, and their memory of what had been done to them. The Sephardic Jewish diaspora, as it came to be called, would shape Jewish history for centuries, and it began with a decree signed in the same year that Columbus set sail under the Spanish flag. The Spanish Inquisition's attention shifted over time. In the early decades, conversos were the primary target. By the mid-16th century, as the Protestant Reformation transformed the religious landscape of Europe, the Inquisition turned increasingly toward Lutheranism and other Protestant influences. It also began to investigate a wider range of offenses: blasphemy, bigamy, solicitation in the confessional, and the practices of the Moriscos, Muslim converts, who faced their own expulsion from Spain in 1609. The Inquisition became, in effect, a general instrument of religious and social conformity, its reach extending into areas of private life that had previously been beyond institutional scrutiny. And here we encounter one of the deepest paradoxes of the institution. The Spanish Inquisition, in its later phases, was in some respects more lenient toward accused witches than the secular courts of Northern Europe. While witch trials in Germany, Scotland, and France were producing mass executions in the 16th and 17th centuries, driven by a combination of popular hysteria, local political dynamics, and the particular theology of Protestant and Catholic reformers, the Spanish Inquisition's theologians were largely skeptical of the reality of witchcraft as a theological threat. Inquisitors who investigated witch accusations in the Basque country and Navarre in the early 17th century concluded that most of the accused were deluded or lying, not genuinely in league with the devil. The Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias, after investigating thousands of witchcraft accusations in 1609 and 1610, reported that he had found no evidence that a single act of witchcraft had actually occurred. His report led the Suprema to effectively suspend witchcraft prosecutions in Spain. This was not mercy, it was skepticism. But the outcome was that Spain, under the Inquisition, executed far fewer people for witchcraft than Protestant England, Scotland, or the German territories. History is rarely simple. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542 by Pope Paul III, was a third distinct institution, different again from both the medieval and Spanish versions. It was created in response to the Protestant Reformation and was primarily concerned with controlling the spread of Protestant ideas in Italy. It is best known today for two cases that became symbols of the conflict between religious authority and intellectual inquiry: the cases of Giordano Bruno and Galileo Galilei. Giordano Bruno was a Dominican friar, philosopher, and cosmologist who had embraced and extended the Copernican model of the solar system to argue that the universe was infinite, that there were countless other worlds, and that the traditional Christian cosmology was fundamentally mistaken. He was also, by most accounts, a difficult, combative, and theologically radical figure who held views on the nature of Christ, the soul, and the divine that went well beyond astronomy. He was arrested by the Roman Inquisition in 1593, tried over a period of 7 years, and burned at the stake in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in February 1600. The specific charges on which he was condemned remain partially unclear. The records of his trial were lost or destroyed, but his case became a symbol of the Inquisition's hostility to intellectual freedom. A statue of Bruno stands today in the Campo de' Fiori, on the exact spot where he was executed. It was erected in 1889 over the objections of the Vatican. Galileo's case is more nuanced and more famous. Galileo Galilei, the Florentine mathematician and astronomer, was investigated by the Roman Inquisition twice. First in 1616, when he was warned not to hold or defend the Copernican heliocentric model, and again in 1633, when he was tried for violating that injunction with his publication of the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. The 1633 trial resulted in Galileo being forced to recant his support for heliocentrism and placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. He was not tortured, the threat of torture was made, but not carried out, and he was not executed. He died in 1642, still under house arrest, still working on physics. The popular story that he muttered, "and yet it moves," after his recantation is almost certainly a legend. There is no contemporary evidence for it. But the case itself is real, and its significance is enormous. It represents the moment when the Catholic Church's institutional authority came into direct conflict with the emerging methods of empirical science and chose authority over evidence. The consequences of that choice echoed through the scientific revolution and into the Enlightenment. Now let us step back and ask a question that the history demands. How did ordinary people experience the Inquisition? Not the famous cases, not Bruno or Galileo, but the thousands of men and women who appeared before inquisitorial tribunals in Spanish cities, Italian towns, Portuguese villages. What did the Inquisition mean to them? The answer depends enormously on who you were. For an old Christian of modest means with no converso ancestry, no Protestant sympathies, and no interest in theological speculation, the Inquisition was probably a background presence, frightening in the abstract, but unlikely to directly touch your life. The public ceremonies of the auto de fe, the act of faith, the public ritual at which sentences were read and punishments carried out, were attended by large crowds, sometimes including royalty. They were civic and religious events as much as punishments, designed to demonstrate the power of the institution and the seriousness of heresy. Watching an auto de fe was not considered a morbid curiosity. It was a religious duty, an opportunity to witness the Church's mercy toward those who repented and its justice toward those who did not. For a converso family in Seville or Toledo or Valladolid, the experience was entirely different. The Inquisition was an ever-present threat, woven into the fabric of daily life. A neighbor who saw you light candles on a Friday evening might report you. A servant who noticed that you did not eat pork might report you. A business rival who wanted your property might report you. The denunciation system was not anonymous in the sense that the inquisitors did not know who the accusers were. They did know, but it was anonymous to the accused, who could not directly confront those who had spoken against them. The psychological effect of this asymmetry was profound. It created a society in which trust was eroded, in which private behavior was constantly monitored, not by the state directly, but by the social network that fed information to the state. Michel Foucault, the 20th century French philosopher, wrote about the panopticon, the idea of a prison in which inmates behave as if they are constantly watched because they can never be sure when they are being watched. The Spanish Inquisition created something functionally similar across an entire society. The records of individual cases that survive in the archives give us glimpses of real human lives caught in this machinery. There is the case of a young converso woman in Toledo in the 1480s who was accused of reverting to Jewish practices. The evidence against her: she had been seen washing her hands before eating. She had changed her linen on a Saturday. She had been heard to say a prayer in a language that sounded like Hebrew. She denied the charges. She was tortured. She confessed. She was reconciled to the church and sentenced to wear a San Benito, a penitential garment, for a period of years. Her property was partially confiscated. Her children would carry the stigma of her trial for generations. There is the case of a Morisco farmer in Valencia in the early 17th century, accused of maintaining Islamic practices, praying in the Muslim fashion, fasting during Ramadan, refusing to eat pork. He argued, through his court-appointed defender, that he had been baptized as a Christian, that he attended Mass, that he knew the Creed and the Lord's Prayer. The inquisitors were not satisfied. He was sentenced to flogging and galley service, a sentence that, given the conditions of Spanish galleys in the 17th century, was often effectively a death sentence. There is the case of a priest in Córdoba in the 1550s, accused of Lutheran sympathies after a colleague reported that he had praised certain Protestant ideas about grace and salvation in a private conversation. He was a genuinely learned man, a careful theologian, someone who had been reading Erasmus and engaging seriously with the debates of the Reformation. He was not a Protestant. But the line between serious Catholic engagement with Protestant ideas and Protestant sympathy was, in the eyes of the Inquisition, dangerously thin. He was investigated, humiliated, and effectively silenced. His career was destroyed. He never published the works he had been preparing. These cases matter because they remind us that the Inquisition's most pervasive effect was not the dramatic auto de fe, but the slow, grinding suppression of intellectual and religious life. Spain, in the mid-16th century, was one of the most powerful and culturally dynamic societies in the world. Its universities were among the best in Europe. Its theologians were engaged with the most important questions of the age. Its artists and writers were producing work of extraordinary richness. And then, gradually, the Inquisition's Index of Forbidden Books, first issued in 1559, began to close down the intellectual space. Works by Erasmus were prohibited. Works by major Spanish mystics were investigated. The great humanist tradition that had flourished in early 16th century Spain began to contract, to become cautious, to self-censor. The historian Richard Kagan has argued that the Inquisition's long-term effect on Spanish intellectual life was more damaging than its direct persecution of individuals, that the culture of surveillance and conformity it created gradually narrowed the range of ideas that could be safely expressed, and that this narrowing had lasting consequences for Spain's engagement with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. This is the second major wow fact of this history. The Inquisition's most lasting damage was not to the bodies of its victims, but to the minds of those it never touched. The people who self-censored, the books that were never written, the ideas that were never expressed, the intellectual culture that grew cautious and then timid and then, in certain domains, effectively stopped. The Portuguese Inquisition, established in 1536, operated on a similar model to the Spanish, with a particular focus on the New Christians, conversos who had been forcibly baptized in Portugal in 1497 when King Manuel I, under pressure from Ferdinand and Isabella as a condition of his marriage to their daughter, ordered the mass conversion of Portugal's Jewish community. The Portuguese Inquisition was, by most measures, even more focused on converso persecution than its Spanish counterpart, and it operated with particular intensity in the 16th and 17th centuries. It also extended its reach to Portugal's overseas empire, to Brazil, to Goa in India, to the African trading posts, making it one of the first truly global inquisitorial institutions. The Goa Inquisition deserves specific mention because it represents one of the most extreme examples of inquisitorial practice outside Europe. Established in 1560 in Portugal's most important Asian colony, the Goa Inquisition operated in a society where the lines between Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam were fluid and contested, where conversion was often nominal, and where the local population had its own deep religious traditions that did not map neatly onto European theological categories. The inquisitors in Goa prosecuted not only crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims, but also Hindu practices among nominal Christians, indigenous religious ceremonies, and what they classified as superstition. The French traveller Charles Delin, who was himself imprisoned by the Goa Inquisition in the 1670s and later wrote an account of his experience, described it as one of the most terrifying institutions he had ever encountered. The Goa Inquisition was not finally abolished until 1812, making it one of the longest-running inquisitorial bodies in history. By the 18th century, the Inquisition across Europe was in visible decline. The Enlightenment had transformed the intellectual landscape. The idea that the state had the right to regulate private religious belief was increasingly challenged by philosophers from Voltaire to John Locke. The last burning at the stake by the Spanish Inquisition occurred in 1826, the execution of a schoolteacher named Caetano, convicted of teaching deist ideas to his students. The Spanish Inquisition was formally abolished in 1834. The Roman Inquisition was reorganized and renamed multiple times. Its institutional successor, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, still exists today in the Vatican, though its methods are, needless to say, entirely different. The legacy of the Inquisition is not a simple story of evil versus good, of darkness versus light. It is a story about the conditions under which institutions that believe themselves to be doing good can cause systematic harm. It is a story about the relationship between fear and power, about how the threat of accusation can reshape an entire society without a single act of violence. It is a story about the long-term costs of intellectual conformity, the ideas not thought, the books not written, the questions not asked. And here is the third wow fact, perhaps the most important of all. The Inquisition was, in a very real sense, a product of modernity, not of the Middle Ages. The medieval Inquisition was built on the legal and administrative innovations of the 12th and 13th centuries, on the new universities, the new legal codes, the new bureaucratic machinery of the medieval church. The Spanish Inquisition was built on the administrative infrastructure of the early modern state, on record-keeping, on centralized authority, on the concept of a national identity defined by religious conformity. It was not a relic of an older, more primitive world. It was a product of the same forces that were building the modern state, the modern university, the modern legal system. This is what makes it so important to understand, and so uncomfortable to contemplate. The Inquisition was not a failure of civilization. It was a particular use of civilization's tools. The Black Legend, the Protestant and later Enlightenment narrative that portrayed the Spanish Inquisition as uniquely barbaric, as the defining expression of Spanish national character, as the embodiment of Catholic fanaticism, was itself a political instrument. It was used to justify English, Dutch, and later French hostility to Spain. It was used to discredit Catholicism in the context of the Reformation. It was used in the 19th and 20th centuries to construct a narrative of Protestant and secular progress against Catholic backwardness. None of this means the Inquisition was not harmful. It was. But the Black Legend distorted the history in ways that served political purposes, and historians have spent the last several decades carefully dismantling its exaggerations while preserving its essential truth, that the Inquisition caused real suffering to real people, that it distorted intellectual life across an entire civilization, and that it represents a warning about the consequences of giving any institution, religious or secular, the authority to define the limits of acceptable thought. The people who built the Inquisition believed they were doing the right thing. Torquemada believed he was protecting the church and saving souls. The inquisitors who sat in judgment believed they were applying the law fairly. The theologians who drafted the procedures believed they were creating a just system. This is not an excuse. It is something more disturbing than an excuse. It is a reminder that the most dangerous institutional harm is rarely done by people who know they are doing wrong. It is done by people who are entirely convinced that they are doing right, operating within a system that has made their certainty feel like virtue. The Campo de' Fiori in Rome is a busy market square today. Tourists buy flowers and vegetables in the morning. In the evening, the bars fill up. At the center of the square stands the statue of Giordano Bruno, hooded, facing the Vatican, his expression unreadable. Most of the people who pass by every day do not know his story, but the square remembers, the stones remember, and the history, if we are willing to read it carefully and honestly, has things to tell us that go far beyond the story of one institution in one era. The Inquisition lasted in various forms for more than 6 centuries. It shaped the religious, intellectual, and social life of Europe and its colonies in ways that are still visible if you know where to look. It produced some of the most detailed records of ordinary life in the early modern period, records that historians use today to reconstruct the daily existence of people who would otherwise have left no trace. It generated a literature of resistance, of testimony, of survival, and it poses, with a clarity that has not faded, the question that every society must answer for itself. Who has the right to define the limits of belief? And what happens when the answer to that question is given to an institution with the power to enforce it? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. The Inquisition is not comfortable history. But it is essential history, the kind that, once you understand it, changes how you see the world you live in. The kind that reminds you that the distance between a society that prizes intellectual freedom and one that enforces conformity is shorter than we like to think, and that the machinery of suppression is almost always built by people who believe, with complete sincerity, that they are building something good. If this video made you think differently about the Inquisition or about history in general, I would genuinely love to hear your perspective in the comments. What surprised you most? What do you want to understand better? This channel exists to make history feel real and to ask the questions that textbooks sometimes skip. If that is something you want more of, consider subscribing. Every new subscriber tells me that this kind of storytelling matters. And if you want to go deeper, the next video in this series looks at the Reformation itself, the movement that the Inquisition was partly built to suppress and which transformed Europe in ways that still shape the world today. That story is waiting for you. The Reformation video link is above, or you can find it on the channel page. But before you go there, let us stay a little longer with the Inquisition, because there are dimensions of this story we have not yet fully explored, and they are among the most humanly compelling. We have talked about the institutions, the procedures, the famous cases. We have talked about conversos and moriscos, about Bruno and Galileo, about the Black Legend and its distortions. But there is a dimension of this history that the institutional narrative tends to obscure, the experience of resistance. Because the Inquisition, for all its power, did not produce a population of passive victims. It produced people who found ways, sometimes ingenious, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes both, to preserve what they valued under conditions of extreme pressure. Consider the converso communities of Spain and Portugal in the 15th and 16th centuries. Faced with forced conversion, faced with the surveillance of the Inquisition, many families developed what historians call crypto-Judaism, the practice of maintaining Jewish identity and religious observance in secret, across generations, under conditions where discovery meant ruin or death. They developed codes. They transmitted knowledge through domestic ritual rather than public worship, through the preparation of food, through the lighting of candles, through prayers whispered in rooms with closed shutters. The women of these communities played a particularly crucial role, because the domestic sphere, the kitchen, the bedroom, the intimate spaces of family life was, at least initially, harder for the Inquisition to penetrate than the public sphere of commerce and worship. The survival of crypto-Jewish communities across centuries of inquisitorial pressure is one of the most remarkable stories of cultural resilience in the historical record. Some of these communities survived not just through the end of the Spanish Inquisition in 1834, but into the 20th century. In the villages of northern Portugal, and in parts of the American Southwest, where converso families had emigrated during the colonial period, descendants of these communities were still observing fragments of Jewish practice in the early 20th century, often without fully understanding their origin. Scholars who interviewed elderly women in these communities in the 1920s and 1930s found them lighting candles on Friday evenings and saying prayers in a language they could not identify, prayers that had been transmitted from mother to daughter for 400 years without anyone in the chain of transmission knowing what language they were in. The language was Hebrew. The prayers were the Shabbat blessings. The Inquisition had tried to erase them. It had failed. This is not a minor footnote. It is a fundamental part of the Inquisition's story, the part that reminds us that institutional power, however comprehensive, is never total. That human beings find ways to preserve what matters to them. That identity is more durable than the machinery built to suppress it. There is also the story of resistance within the Church itself. Not everyone who worked within the Catholic intellectual tradition accepted the Inquisition's methods or its premises. The great Spanish theologian Francisco de Vitoria, writing in the early 16th century, developed arguments about natural law and the rights of indigenous peoples in the Americas that implicitly challenged the logic of forced conversion. The Jesuit order, from its founding in 1540, maintained a complicated and often tense relationship with the Inquisition. Its members were frequently investigated, and several prominent Jesuits ran into serious trouble with inquisitorial authorities. The Spanish mystics Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, both of whom are now canonized saints, were investigated by the Inquisition during their lifetimes. Teresa, whose writings described intense personal experiences of divine union, was suspected of being an alumbrada, a member of a mystical movement that the Inquisition regarded with deep suspicion. She navigated these investigations with a combination of genuine piety, political skill, and a remarkable ability to present her most radical spiritual experiences in language that the inquisitors could not easily condemn. Her survival, and the survival of her writings, was not accidental. It was a product of intelligence and courage. The Inquisition also produced, paradoxically, some of the most important legal thinking about the rights of defendants in Western history. The very fact that the Inquisition operated through formal procedures, that it required written charges, recorded testimony, and reasoned judgments, meant that its operations generated a vast literature of legal commentary and debate. Lawyers and theologians who worked within the system, or who observed it from outside, began to ask questions about the fairness of anonymous accusation, about the reliability of testimony obtained under torture, about the standards of proof required to convict a person of a crime of belief. These questions did not immediately produce reform, but they entered the legal tradition, and they contributed in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but impossible to ignore entirely to the development of the procedural protections that we now consider fundamental to a just legal system. The right to know the charges against you, the right to confront your accusers, the presumption of innocence, the exclusion of evidence obtained through coercion. The history of the Inquisition, in other words, is not only a history of oppression, it is also, indirectly and often despite itself, a history of the ideas that eventually made oppression of this kind unacceptable. The Enlightenment critics of the Inquisition, Voltaire, who mocked it savagely in Candide, Cesare Beccaria, whose 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments argued systematically against torture as a legal instrument, the encyclopedists who catalogued its abuses, were not working in a vacuum. They were responding to a specific institutional history, and their arguments were sharpened by the concrete reality of what the Inquisition had done and continued to do. Beccaria's argument against torture deserves particular attention in this context. He argued, with a clarity that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely radical in its moment, that torture was not only cruel but epistemologically useless, that a person being tortured would say whatever they believed the torturer wanted to hear, not what was true. This meant that the Inquisition's primary tool for establishing truth was, in fact, a mechanism for producing false confessions. The institution had built its entire evidentiary framework on a foundation that its own experience should have revealed as unreliable. The records of the Inquisition, read carefully, actually support Beccaria's argument. There are numerous cases in which accused persons confessed under torture to things that were demonstrably impossible, or that contradicted the testimony of other witnesses, or that they immediately retracted when the torture stopped. The inquisitors were not unaware of this problem. The requirement to ratify confessions the following day was partly designed to address it. But the structural incentives of the system pushed consistently toward obtaining confessions rather than toward establishing truth, and the result was a body of evidence that was, in significant part, a record of what people said when they were afraid, not a record of what they actually believed or did. This brings us to a final reflection on what the Inquisition means for us today. And I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of historical moment where it is tempting to reach for easy modern analogies, and easy modern analogies almost always distort the history they claim to illuminate. The Inquisition was a specific institution, in a specific context, with specific theological and political foundations. It is not simply a metaphor for any system of social pressure or ideological conformity. To treat it as one is to flatten its particularity and to do a disservice to the people whose actual lives it shaped. But there are genuine lessons in this history that do not require false analogy. The first is about the relationship between certainty and institutional power. The Inquisition was built by people who were certain about the nature of truth, certain about the consequences of error, certain that the ends justified the means. That certainty was not cynical, it was sincere. And it produced systematic harm on a scale that the individuals involved could not see, because their certainty prevented them from asking the questions that might have revealed it. Any institution, religious, political, academic, corporate, that combines sincere certainty with the power to enforce conformity has the potential to replicate this dynamic. The specific content of the certainty matters less than the combination of conviction and power. The second lesson is about the social cost of surveillance. The Inquisition did not need to arrest everyone to control everyone. It needed only to create the credible possibility of accusation, to make every person aware that their private behavior was potentially visible to institutional authority. The result was a society in which people modified their behavior not because they had been caught doing something wrong, but because they could not be sure they would not be caught. The intellectual and creative costs of this kind of ambient surveillance are impossible to quantify precisely, but they are real, and the historical record of Spain's intellectual life in the second half of the 16th century, its gradual narrowing, its increasing caution, its retreat from the bold engagement with new ideas that had characterized the early part of the century, is one of the clearest examples we have of what a surveillance culture does to a civilization's capacity for thought. The third lesson is perhaps the simplest and the most important. The people who suffered under the Inquisition were not abstractions. They were not symbols or statistics. They were Juan de Sevilla, waking before dawn to the sound of boots on cobblestones. They were the converso woman in Toledo who washed her hands before eating and lost everything because of it. They were the priest in Córdoba who read too widely and thought too carefully and paid for it with his career and his voice. They were the mothers who whispered Hebrew prayers to their daughters in the dark, not knowing what language they were speaking, only knowing that the words mattered and must not be lost. History is made of people like these, not only of kings and inquisitors and papal bulls and institutional procedures. The machinery of power is real, and we must understand how it works. But the machinery exists in a world of human beings who live inside it, who resist it, who are broken by it, who sometimes survive it, and who sometimes manage, against all the odds that the machinery can bring to bear, to preserve something that the machinery was designed to destroy. That is the Inquisition's story. And it is, in the end, not only a story about fear. It is a story about what people do when they are afraid, and what they refuse to give up even then. It is a story about the limits of institutional power and the durability of human identity. It is a story that deserves to be told carefully, honestly, and completely, without the distortions of the black legend, without the minimizations of institutional apology, and without the false comfort of thinking that the world that produced it is entirely behind us. The boots on the cobblestones have gone quiet now, but the stones remember, and so should we. If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply made you think, please leave a comment below. I read every one of them, and the conversations that happen in the comments section of this channel are genuinely among the best discussions of history I encounter anywhere. If you are new here and this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will not miss what comes next. And what comes next is the Reformation, the movement that shook the world the Inquisition was trying to protect, and that changed everything about how Europeans understood faith, authority, and the individual conscience. It is one of the great turning point stories in Western history, and we are going to tell it the way it deserves to be told. That video is already waiting for you.